Welcome to Art in Review. I'm your host Eve, and today I'll be taking you on an audio journey through Yuki Kihara's exhibition Paradise Camp, curated by Natalie King. Featured at the Venice Biennale in 2022 and located on the second floor of Ultimo Powerhouse, Paradise Camp is a body of work tackling some of the most pressing issues facing Pacific Islanders through sculpture, photography, archives, video, and the light-hearted humour associated with those from Samoa and Aotearoa, New Zealand. As you begin your descent to level 2, Miss King chose a selection of silk banners from the Paradise Camp collection as a visual trail to guide audiences to the rest of the exhibit and provide them with some context to the nature of the exhibition. Quotes such as, "In New Zealand and Australia, I had to adapt to that Western life. I couldn't be the whawhawhine I had to be," sit in the minds of audiences as they approach the first work. At the base of the ramp, we are presented with a large woven mat laying flat on the ground, accompanying a large video work. In this piece, we are introduced to 6 individuals who identify as whawhawhine. These participants discuss what it means to be whawhawhine, how they navigate through colonized spaces as physical manifestations of indigenous culture and spirituality. The layout of this work, a comfortable handmade surface, encourages audiences to sit on the ground or on the benches and engage in dialogue with other patrons about whawhawhine. To your left of the ramp, we are invited to a journey through a corridor where we see a wave break which extends from the floors to the walls and up to the ceiling, like an oceanic portal. The audience is gradually transported into a scene which is reminiscent of the deep Pacific Ocean. As you are pulled into the deeper and deeper blue, images adorning the walls parallel the depth of the surrounding imagery through context and interpretation. At the beginning of the corridor, we are presented with a sculpture that is eerily similar to that of a geography topographical map. The curvatures of this island are conveyed with a polychromed gradient and numerical data. The numeracy displayed on the sculpture confirms to audiences that this landmass is below sea levels. We are then to assume that the sculpture is representative of a reality Samoans and other Pacific nations will face in the near future. As Western greed and exploitative practices continue to impact the environment and the way of life for Indigenous people, the culture and land will begin to sink and eventually disappear entirely under the ocean. This piece forces audiences to consider the real-world devastations that will result from their consumerist behaviours and colonial mindsets. An entire island projected to be underwater all too soon. The colonial exploitation of the Pacific region began in the late 1800s, where French painter Paul Gauguin was commissioned by the French government to travel to these untouched lands and create imagery that would bring about capital gain. Paul Gauguin sold a false history to European audiences that the land and the women of the Pacific region were fertile and naive. The nude models he painted were in fact very young girls who were exploited by Gauguin in order to sell a product that was layered with fetishized imagery. Yuki Kihara unpacks this context through appropriating the imagery of Gauguin's oil paintings and reinventing such imagery with consenting whawhawhine models. The reinvention of this imagery associated with the Pacific Islands, the young Indigenous girl through an exploitative lens to an image of adulthood through a culturally empowering lens, gives agency to Indigenous Pacific Islanders and whawhawhine. A big reason this imagery was so harmful to Indigenous peoples of the Pacific region was due to the suppression of cultural identity with the introduction of Christian doctrine. These light-hearted reinterpretations of Gauguin's work sit at the precipice of the oceanic portal. They are deeply meaningful but relatively shallow when compared with the next works within the corridor. Past the photographic series, we are presented with a long panel of newspaper articles, passport documents, sex education pamphlets, ethnographic photography, and spiritual stories from the Pacific. The audience is faced with a compilation of colonial injustices, gender denial on government documents, concealing Fa'afafine individuals in the tourism industry, misidentifying spiritual practice as drag or gender impersonation. The list goes on. In this archive of purposeful neglect, we are confronted with the reality of Western influence, and in turn are made to be accomplices in the destruction of culture. Fa'afafine were turned into a spectacle by the media, digestible to Western audiences. As a result, the complexities of Pacific culture were diminished and agency was stripped from Indigenous peoples. Through the works of Paradise Camp, Yuki Kihara attempts to reclaim their culture and take agency away from the non-Indigenous bodies that were occupying their space. These individuals who have tried to occupy and manipulate the history of Pacific Islands in order to exploit the land and its people. Entire islands are being bought and sold internationally for the purpose of extracting as much capital from the land as possible. The implications of this continuous exploitation can be traced back to the beginning of colonialism, back to the beginning of this oceanic portal, the narrative device that is guiding audiences through this exhibition. It is understood that before the introduction of colonialism, that these communities within the Pacific Islands, before Christian doctrines, were entirely matriarchal societies. Audiences are encouraged to question why colonial bodies would try to diminish a culture which valued female and queer bodies as leaders. Audiences may even connect the image of a gender-fluid individual that emerged from the water, the origin story of the Fa'afafine, to be a physical manifestation of the land itself. The idea of respecting women and in turn the land strictly opposes the patriarchal values of the West. As audiences emerge on the other side of the portal, they may wonder how this exhibition could have looked had the course of history played out differently. Would the land not be at risk had women and Fa'afafine remained in charge? Would Christianity be dominating the Pacific region had they not been fed the lies of Western imperialism? Much like any other archival or speculative work, Kihara leaves audiences wanting answers to questions that may never be fully resolved. Paradise Camp draws connections between climate change, the concealment of culture, and the dissemination of false histories by colonial powers. And onto the review. The conceptual depth of this exhibition was definitely apparent and felt by audiences. However, the space itself was quite limiting. The short corridor left more to be desired. I found that the space provided for this exhibition was far too small for the scale of the topics being presented to audiences. The compilation of archival documents, whilst effective in bombarding audiences with a clearly long history of abuse, was ultimately a curatorial failure. Had the corridor been longer or led to a space filled with more works by Kihara that tie up the ideas presented earlier on, the exhibition as a whole would have left audiences feeling more empowered to take on these colonial structures. The abrupt ending of the exhibition space stopped audiences in their tracks and ultimately led them to an interactive space that caught their attention with AR gimmicks. The impact of Kihara's work was short-lived as the interactive space took over the attention of audiences leaving the work. The lack of cohesion on the second floor in terms of content made the exhibition feel disjointed and misplaced even. This exhibition would have been more effective in communicating ideas facing Pacific Islanders and Fa'afafine had it been located adjacent to either Absolutely Queer or 100 Climate Conversations, also located at the Powerhouse Museum. Despite this, I give this exhibition an 8.5 out of 10, as the exhibition as a whole was informative, curated thoughtfully, and led me down, ultimately, a long rabbit hole of Pacific histories after my visit. If you're interested in any of the topics mentioned in this audio guide, I would highly recommend visiting the Powerhouse Museum in Ultimo and paying this work some respect. Thank you for listening, and be sure to stop by another time for another episode of Art in Review. Thank you.